I just got home I was out last night, I got home just now, and everybody's dead. I went out, my dad's dead.
How many people are there?
There's like 6, my whole family's dead.
One of the most horrifying crimes imaginable, at least to me, is a family massacre. We're taught to fear strangers, lock your doors, watch your back. But what happens when the danger is already inside? When the person who ends your life is someone who once sat at your dinner table, or the person who tucks you in at night? One of the people you trust the most, or, well, trusted. That's not just murder, that's betrayal in its purest, darkest form. Family is supposed to be your safest place, the people who protect you no matter what. Those who provide and offer unconditional love, unwavering trust. So when those bonds are broken in blood, the horror cuts deeper than any headline can capture. And disturbingly, these betrayals, these family annihilations, are happening more often. It's no longer just a rare tragedy, it's a pattern. And the numbers are staggering. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, family violence made up 11% of all reported and unreported violent crimes between 1998 and 2002. In 2002 alone, about 22% of all murders were committed by a family member. But since 2020, the frequency of family massacres, also known as familicide, has taken a chilling turn. Over 200 family annihilations have occurred right here in the US since the start of the pandemic. That's nearly 1 in every 5 days. Now, just let that sink in for a moment. On average, every 5 days, somewhere right here in America, an entire family is wiped out, often by the person they trusted the most. DomesticShelters.org confirms this disturbing trend with similar figures. The annual breakdown is grim. 62 cases in 2020, 61 in 2021, 72 in 2022. With those numbers seemingly increasingly yearly, that's putting us on track for nearly 100 cases in a single year. And those numbers are only increasing. Experts point to a cocktail of causes: access to firearms, untreated mental illness, substance abuse, financial pressures, and just the overall crushing weight of isolation, all intensified in a post-COVID world. And the case that we're covering today is not just another statistic. Not only has it been called one of the most brutal mass murders in Georgia's history, but also one of, if not the worst family massacre in Georgia's history, and one of the most haunting examples of familial betrayal ever recorded. The Toler family massacre, also known as the Glenn County mass murder, was more than just a crime. It was a brutal and a calculated annihilation of nearly an entire household. Someone turned a place of safety into a scene of horror. And while the state believes they found that someone, others question whether the true perpetrator ever faced justice at all. I'm Nichole Mondshein, and this is Final Judgment, a deep dive into the final days, last choices, and chilling moments before execution on Georgia's death row. Some convictions unravel while some sentences are overturned. The evidence has been laid bare, the jury has spoken. But was justice truly served? For some, there's no appeal, no second chances, just the final judgment. But for others, the final judgment isn't so final after all. The Toler family, a large, blended group, all live together in a cramped, rundown single-wide mobile home at New Hope Mobile Home Park off US Highway 17, tucked away in Glenn County, Georgia, near the city of Brunswick. At times, as many as 13 people would live under that one small roof. 13 souls, family, friends, children, parents, partners, babies, all packed into a 980 square foot trailer, trying to make life work the only way they knew how, together. They didn't have much. Money was tight, the walls were thin, the floor creaked, but poverty didn't define them. Not in the way they treated each other, not in the way they lived. The Toler family was like any other close-knit Southern family, just trying their best to stay afloat. Working multiple minimum wage jobs, moving from place to place, sharing what little they had. It wasn't always easy. With that many people in such a small space, tensions were inescapable at times. Privacy was rare, quiet moments even rarer. But for the most part, the family made it work. They were a patchwork of love and struggle, a big, messy, chaotic family with a lot of heart and love. The trailer was rented for just around $405 a month by Russell Toler Sr., who many saw as the heart and soul of the home. At 44 years old, Russell Sr. was described by those who knew him as humble, kind, generous. The kind of man who kept to himself, but always showed up for the people he loved. He had worked at the nearby Aero Instant plant for over 20 years, doing whatever it took to keep food on the table for his family. He wasn't perfect, no one is. In 2004, he had a small run-in with the law involving a domestic dispute, but those charges were dropped. What people remembered more than that, though, was his loyalty and his calm spirit. That's just who he was. A protector, a provider, a quiet anchor in a storm of uncertainty. Russell Sr. had 4 children who he adored. They were his life. He wasn't rich, far from it, but he worked hard to give them what he could. First, there was 22-year-old Chrissy Toler, his oldest daughter. Life hadn't been easy for Chrissy. She dropped out of school at 16 and was known for getting into fights when she was younger. She was a little rough around the edges, had a rebellious streak like most teens, but also had a record to go with it, including pleading guilty in a 2006 armed robbery case. She took a deal that required her to testify against her child's father, Byron Jimerson, who is currently serving a 20-year sentence. Their son, Byron Jr., or BJ for short, lived in the trailer with her, her father, and the rest of her siblings. She was a young mom trying to figure life out, fighting her demons in a home already full of noise and chaos. Living with Chrissy and her family was her boyfriend, 30-year-old Joseph West. Now, he wasn't Byron's biological father, but he stepped into that role without hesitation. He loved Chrissy, and he loved her son too. Like many others living in the trailer, Joseph West also had a troubled past, a history that included charges for drug possession, forgery, and theft. But those close to him said he had a good heart and was genuinely trying to turn things around. Still, as we'll later learn, Joseph was allegedly involved in selling drugs, according to someone very close to the case. Now, being a drug dealer doesn't automatically make someone a bad person. People often make choices out of survival or circumstance, but it is still against the law, and it complicates the picture when trying to understand what really happened that night, so I want you just to keep that little detail in mind. Then there was Russell Toler Jr., who was 20, known as Little Rusty for short, quiet, respectful, and hardworking, just like his father, Russell Sr. He worked in roofing and construction and loved fishing with his dad. The two bonded over that time and would often take fishing trips together away from the hustle and bustle and noise of the house. He was quiet and didn't fight with his siblings. He liked to stay out of trouble. Little Rusty was the kind of guy people just liked to be around. Then there was 19-year-old Michael Toler, who was the third child, and by all accounts, the shining light of the family. Michael had Down syndrome, and though he faced challenges throughout his life, including needing to have multiple surgeries, he remained joyful, optimistic, and full of energy. His laugh was contagious. He loved people, and people just loved him back. He also just loved life. He was training for a job with Goodwill Industries, determined to work and be independent despite his condition. Teachers remembered him as hardworking and free-spirited. He had a fierce determination and saw just about the best in everyone, and everyone saw the best in him. Literally, no one had anything bad to say about Michael. And then there was the baby of the family, Nichole Toler, just 15 years old. A bubbly 8th grader at Needwood Middle School, Nichole was known for her huge heart. She also loved fishing with her dad and always tried to lift people up when they were down. She was still figuring out who she wanted to be. She was a teen, but one thing was clear. She was loved and had a lot of friends. And also living in the home was 49-year-old Brenda Gale Falligan, who was Russell Sr.'s sister. Now, Brenda had suffered a debilitating stroke and was now confined to a wheelchair. Years earlier, she lost her son in a house fire, a tragedy that left a lasting wound, emotionally and physically. She then had lived with another sister until that sister passed away, so she had nowhere else to go, which is then when she moved in with Russell and his family, relying on them to care for her in her final years. Now, sharing this already crowded space was the Hines family, longtime family friends with the Tolers. not related by blood, but close enough to feel like kin. Guy Hines Sr., who was 45 years old, had been friends with Russell Sr. for years, decades even. He was a truck driver, a quiet man who worked hard, kept to himself, and carried his own set of struggles. In the mid-1980s, he had several forgery charges on his record, but friends said he tried to do right by his family. Then, after a workplace accident involving a tire explosion, he was never just quite the same. Shaken, jittery, a little off balance. But still, he tried his best, just like Russell Sr., to provide as much as he could for his kids. Then there was Guy Hines Jr., his son, known as Little Guy. He had a complicated relationship with his father, loving but rocky. He worked construction jobs, hanging drywall, and dreamed of being a trucker, just like his dad. He came and went from the trailer, a part of the family chaos, but never fully grounded in it. Now, Guy Jr. grew up in Georgia with a close-knit family, especially super close to his grandmother and younger brother Tyler. By all accounts, his childhood was relatively happy. He loved the outdoors, playing sports, and just being around people. His early teens marked a shift though. By age 12, that's when he started experimenting with marijuana. And by 15, he had a run-in with the law after stealing guns with friends to try to buy drugs. As a result, he was sent to a juvenile boot camp aimed at redirecting troubled youth. Then, at 17, tragedy struck when his mother died of a drug overdose, a loss that deeply affected both him and his brother Tyler. Despite his ongoing use of drugs, family members described Guy as someone who held down steady jobs and wasn't known for violence or confrontation. Just weeks before the murders, Guy had moved into the Toler family's trailer just temporarily, along with his father, while they waited to relocate to their own trailer plot. Now, I want you to keep in mind that his brother Tyler wasn't living with the Toler family and had his own separate accommodations. According to Guy and Tyler, though, the Toler and Hines families had been close for years, vacationing together and spending holidays side by side. It was a tight-knit household, and any tensions were considered minor. Guy Jr. was basically just as close with the Toler family as he was with his own family. And like I said before, that's what this household was. Chaotic. People always coming and going. The home was always full, noisy, and just unpredictable. But this chaos worked for them. It was a strange kind of harmony. They laughed, they fought, they looked after one another. It wasn't perfect. It was messy and loud and raw. But it was theirs, and it was their family. Until it all crumbled. The plan was for Guy and his father to actually move out of the mobile home they all shared the weekend of August 29, 2009, the day after the brutal slayings of an entire family that would rock the history of Georgia forever. On the morning of August 29, 2009, just after 8 a.m., a frantic 911 call came into the Glenn County Police Department. A neighbor of the Toler and Hines family, Margaret Orlinsky, who also went by the name Peggy, was on the line. She lived right next door to the Toler's mobile home, and she told dispatch that morning, Guy Jr., he literally had just come home to the mobile home park and was absolutely hysterical. When she found him, he was screaming, panicked, yelling that his entire family was dead, including his own father. In the chilling recording, you can literally hear Guy Jr. take the phone, his voice cracking with shock and fear as he says, "My whole family is dead." Then he rushes back inside the trailer. He tells dispatchers that it looks like they've all been beaten. You can hear him yell in the background of the 911 call, his voice sounding desperate. The ambulance better hurry, because one of his cousins, Michael Toler, is still alive, but according to Guy Jr., his face was smashed in, which he says on the call. Neighbors, hearing all the chaos happening, began pouring out of their homes that morning. This was a tight-knit, sleepy mobile home park. Everyone knew each other. Everyone looked out for one another. Maintenance staff, neighbors, children, all frozen in shock, watching the horror unfold just a few doors and literal steps away. Even the maintenance man of the community also got on the phone with dispatch. He was afraid to go inside in the single-wide trailer, which obviously now was an active crime scene. But what everyone didn't know yet was that they all had just become witnesses to one of the most brutal mass murders in Georgia's history. Now we're going to play the 911 call for you. Now, just a warning, It is graphic. Listener discretion is strongly advised.
Yeah, here, talk to me. Hello, I just got home, my whole family's dead.
Oh, okay, tell me what's going on, sir. What?
I just got home I was out last night, I got home just now, and everybody's dead. Oh, yeah, my dad's dead.
How
My
many
uncle's
people
dead.
are there?
There's like 6, my whole family's dead.
Okay,
It looks like they've been beaten to death, I don't know, man.
you're what, 47 New Hope Plantation, correct?
Yeah, man, I mean, I don't know what to do, man. Family's dead.
How many people are there? Your dad, who else is there?
My dad, my uncle, my cousins.
Okay, don't touch anything, okay, sir?
Man, what?
Don't touch anything. Stay away from the residence, okay? So stay with your
Man,
neighbors.
I don't know what that, man. My whole family's dead. My dad's dead. He's really dead.
I know. They're gonna come. They're on their way, okay?
Hi, my name's Mike. I'm maintenance out here. Oh, just like, yeah, tell him to hurry. Just think Michael's still alive. Still alive? Yeah, Michael's alive. He needs an ambulance.
How old is Michael, and what happened to them? Can
Michael is one of the family members. He's got Down syndrome. Okay, guys, calm down. They're on their way.
When dispatchers arrived at the Toler mobile home that morning, they walked into a nightmare. Police found Guy Jr. and his neighbor, Peggy, out front, trying to restrain the family's dog. And inside, what they discovered was nothing short of a massacre. 9 people had been brutally attacked. 7 of them, Brenda, Guy Sr., Russell Sr., Chrissy, Russell Jr., Michelle, and Joseph, were all already dead. Michael and Chrissy's 3-year-old son, BJ, were still clinging to life, but barely. Tragically, Michael later died at the hospital, leaving BJ as the sole survivor of the slaughter. But even though BJ survived, he was in critical condition and had a long road to recovery. Blood was everywhere, splattered across walls, soaked into furniture, and staining the floor near every body. According to the medical examiner, the victims had been severely beaten with a blunt, cylinder type of object resembling that of a shotgun barrel. Investigators say that everyone had died due to blunt force trauma to the head, besides one person, Russell Toler Jr., Russell Sr.'s son, who he had also been stabbed. At the scene, Guy Jr. told police that he returned home shortly after 8 a.m., something his neighbor Peggy, again, she confirmed. According to her, she saw him literally pull into the driveway at that time. As he walked up to the trailer, he claimed that he just so happened to notice that the front door was unlocked, but this wasn't unusual for a rather large family. Not everyone had a key, so he didn't really think much of it at the time. But the moment he stepped inside, he was hit with a scene straight out of a nightmare. His father, Guy Sr., was lying motionless in a pool of blood, clearly beaten and unresponsive. Stunned, Guy began walking through the home, room by room, discovering the rest of his family, bloody, lifeless, disfigured. His mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. In full panic, he began searching for a phone so he could call authorities. The trailer was in obvious disarray, but he eventually found his cousin Michelle's cell, but it wouldn't turn on. Thinking the battery was dead, Guy Jr. kept looking. In one bedroom, he found his uncle Russell Sr. dead on the floor and his cousin Michael on the bed, motionless but still breathing, but just barely. Again, blood was everywhere. Next to one of the bodies was a shotgun, so according to Guy Jr., he grabbed it, terrified that the killer might still be inside. Disoriented, confused, and in an obvious state of shock, he claims he then stumbled outside, yelling for help. He stashed the shotgun in the trunk of his car and dropped the phone in the back seat. Trying to calm his nerves, he lit a marijuana cigarette, not to be reckless, but because his body was breaking down from what he had just seen. So now by this point, neighbors had heard his screams. That's when Peggy, the neighbor who saw him pull up earlier, called 911. Guy says that while he was waiting for police to arrive on the scene, he was running between room and room, checking his loved ones to see if anyone had a pulse. That's when he realized that the two of them, Michael and BJ, were still alive. So in a desperate rush, he ran to a neighbor's house to get help, then returned to sit beside Michael in the bed until first responders arrived. When police finally arrived, they initially asked Guy Jr. if there were any weapons in the home. Guy Jr. said there was a 20-gauge shotgun inside and a 16-gauge in his car's trunk. The gun he claims he moved after finding the body, saying it had been stolen. But that just wasn't true. Records later confirmed it hadn't been stolen at all. Investigators found the broken stock of a 20-gauge shotgun near Russell Toler Sr.'s body, but the barrel was missing. And then when they looked in Guy's trunk, they found the 16-gauge shotgun smeared with dried blood, some of it belonging to Russell Sr., and a bloody fingerprint that matched Guy Jr. Also in the car, police found a bag of marijuana, a bottle of sedative pills prescribed to Michael, and Michelle's cell phone, which was also covered in Joseph's blood. Though Guy Jr. didn't appear to be actively bleeding, he had scratches on his hands and blood on his clothing. The khaki shorts he was wearing had Russell Sr.'s blood on them, as well as another pair of shorts he owned had blood from Michael, Russell Sr., and Chrissy. His sandals had also been stained with the blood of Joseph and Guy Sr., his own father. But again, I can only imagine the horror of this mobile home if there was blood and bodies literally everywhere. In the bedroom where Russell Sr.'s body was found, police discovered a document with a smear of Russell's blood and fingerprints that belonged to Guy Jr. A knife in the living room tested positive for Russell Jr.'s blood. At first, police thought the victims might have been shot. That's how severe the injuries were. But they quickly realized the brutality had come from blunt force, not bullets. The broken shotgun stock, along with the blood-covered 16-gauge, suggested a horrifying alternative. The victims may have been beaten with shotguns, not shot by them. When asked where he had been the night before, Guy Jr. initially gave conflicting stories. He told police he had smoked marijuana and used cocaine with Joseph, Chrissy's boyfriend. But toxicology reports showed Joseph had no drugs in his system. Guy Jr., however, did test positive for marijuana, cocaine, and sedatives. Witnesses who saw him the night before the murder said that Guy Jr. seemed tense, nervous, and clearly under the influence. The day after the murders, August 30th, Guy Jr. was arrested, but not for murder. He was charged with drug possession, lying to police, obstruction, and tampering with evidence. His bond was set as $20,000, and he was placed under home confinement with an electronic monitoring device. Investigators were closing in, though. At one of the first press conferences about this case, Glenn County Police Chief Matt Doring later said that 2 new pieces of evidence came to light that changed everything.
A little after 8 a.m., we received a 911 call to come out here to the Nichole Mobile Home Park. The call was in regard to multiple victims or multiple persons that were deceased inside a single mobile home. When the officers arrived, they went in and did find, as we know now, 7 deceased victims inside the mobile home and 2 others that were still alive, of which they sought medical attention. Those 2 were removed by medical services. They were transported to our local hospital, and then 1, I understand, was life flighted to Savannah. The other, I'm not sure, but the 2 are in Savannah right now, undergoing treatment. That's a total of 9 victims, okay? And the autopsies are scheduled to start in the morning at the crime lab in Savannah. Many of you asked me earlier if I had any suspects or if we had any suspects, and I can't tell you that we do. We're working hard to develop leads. We're following up on leads.
But the police chief would never actually confirm what those 2 pieces of evidence were. Then on September 4th, just hours after being released on bond on his previous charges, Guy Jr. was rearrested, this time for murder, so his bond was revoked.
Late this afternoon, very late this afternoon, 2 pieces of information came forward to us. We took those 2 pieces of information, compared it to the whole of all the evidence collected all week long. We were satisfied that led us to believe that Guy Hines Jr. is a responsible person for the murders.
According to Guy, he was picked up at the jail by his grandma and brother Tyler, and the police followed them home after he bonded out the first time on his unrelated charges. Then, according to him, roughly 10 minutes or so after he returned to his grandma's home, Police then knocked on her door and said his bail was revoked. That's when they put him back in the police car and brought him back to jail in connection with this massacre. And in that moment, he was indicted by a grand jury and formally charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder for the attack on 3-year-old BJ, who, again, was still alive but in critical condition at this time. The district attorney announced that they were going to pursue the death penalty against Guy Jr. According to prosecutors, the motive was drugs and money. Their theory: Guy Jr. entered the bedroom where Russell Sr. was sleeping and confronted him about pills that were prescribed to Michael. That's when they claim a fight broke out. Then Guy allegedly killed Russell Sr., then beat Michael when he awoke and continued through the house, killing the rest of the family, most of whom were sleeping. According to them, these murders were fueled by a drug-fueled rage, while Guy Jr. was under the influence. Their argument seemed to rest more on Guy Jr.'s general drug use and lifestyle than on proving he was under a specific influence when the crime actually occurred. And that literal same day as Guy Jr. was charged with the mass murder, 7 of the 8 victims were laid to rest. Over 200 mourners gathered at Young's Island Church in Eulonia. Their bodies were buried all next to one another. Joseph West's funeral was held separately and his grave is elsewhere. But not everyone believed that Guy Jr. was capable of such horror. Now, at the funerals for the Toler family and Guy Sr., Guy Jr.'s grandfather and younger brother Tyler stood by him. "I know my brother didn't do this," Tyler said. "My brother has a conscience. Maybe he crossed the wrong person. Maybe someone came after the family, but he didn't do this. My dad and uncle and cousin were fighters. They wouldn't go down without a struggle. Whoever did this has injuries, and they're out there walking around while my brother sits in jail."
Tyler Hines also said he knew his brother didn't commit the crimes. He also spoke of his father.
My dad was just a good guy. He never meant any harm to anybody. I mean, he just went on about his life, and he tried to make his own living. He never asked for handouts or anything. He was an independent man.
Their grandfather, William Hines, agreed. He loved his dad, he said. You could hear the devastation in his voice on the 911 call. "I just can't believe it unless they really have proof." Now, according to Guy Jr., here's how the events unfolded in the day leading up to the murders, as best as he remembers. Now, this was in 2009. Not everyone had a cell phone back then. He didn't have a cell phone. So the timeline is a bit fuzzy, but this is the version he has consistently shared to this day. On August 28th, the day before the murders, the guy says he left for work around 7 a.m., getting picked up by his boss at the entrance of the trailer park, a routine that they followed almost daily. He was working in construction at the time on a home that was not too far from the mobile home park. Then around noon, he and his boss met with a contractor. Then later in the day, he was dropped off by his boss at a friend's apartment, a guy named Zach, so that they could hang out and just relax. Guy says that him and Zach went to get food, smoked some weed, and went shopping for new clothes to wear that night because they were hoping that they would end up at a bar. And while they were out shopping, he says he ran into his brother Tyler and invited him to hang out later. He also called Chrissy and her boyfriend Joe, who, according to Guy Jr., allegedly dealt drugs because Guy wanted to buy some. He claims that's when the trio all met up and smoked in his car. Guy says he returned to the trailer around 7 p.m., and from what he remembers, everyone was home and nothing seemed unusual. Later that night, around 9 p.m., he claims Russell Jr. called him asking for help fixing a battery cable on his car. Guy says he helped him out, hung around a bit, and then borrowed Russell's car to meet up with a girl, but ended up backing out due to just being nervous and being high. Instead, he claims he went back to Joe to get more drugs, then headed to Barrington County Park, a spot he says he knew was quiet and far from police presence so that he could be in peace to smoke. Surveillance footage later confirmed that Guy was seen at a convenience store, Parker by the Pier, around 5:30 a.m. on the morning of August 29th. From there, he says he went to a hotel where his brother Tyler was staying. Then the two of them got breakfast at a restaurant called Huddle House, and then afterward, that's when Guy decided to head back home. He returned to the trailer around 8 a.m. As we all know, That's when he says he walked into a nightmare. That's when he found his entire family brutally beaten to death. After his arrest, Guy Jr. was held at the Glenn County Detention Center while prosecutors and his defense team worked through months of pretrial motions. His lawyers from the Georgia Capitol Defender's Office decided not to request a change of venue, believing Glenn County offered the best chance for a fair trial. Picking the jury was a slow and intense process. For about a month, attorneys and Judge Stephen Scarlett questioned over 70 potential jurors, trying to find people open to considering all three possible punishments if Guy Jr. was convicted. There was the death penalty, life in prison without parole, or life with the possibility of parole. Eventually, 12 jurors and a few alternates were chosen and sequestered for the trial. One of the biggest mysteries surrounding this case, then and now, was how one person could have possibly killed 8 people and tried to kill a child, all inside a small, single-wide mobile home. The crime was so brutal that investigators initially believed there had to have been multiple attackers, just assuming that multiple people had to be involved. The full scale of violence inside that cramped Brunswick mobile home was laid bare during the trial when the medical examiner testified about the victim's injuries. Over the course of 8 autopsies, he documented more than 220 individual wounds, mostly from blunt force trauma to the head. Injuries so extreme that he compared them to what you'd see in car crashes or falls from great heights. Each victim had been struck multiple times with devastating force. Guy Sr. suffered 22 external injuries to his head, neck, and shoulders. Rusty Sr. had over 30, including a massive, nearly 6-inch gash across the top of his skull. Russell Jr. had several teeth knocked out and had been stabbed 3 times, while also beaten. Nichole had 48 separate injuries, including broken bones in her hand, possible defensive wounds. And Brenda was actually the only one killed differently from the rest of the family. Investigators say Brenda was found with a pillow over her face, suffocated, as if she knew the attacker, because suffocating someone in this manner, according to authorities, is believed to be incredibly personal. The medical examiner stated that it would have been probably taken the attacker around 2 to 3 hours to go around the trailer systematically, killing all the occupants, since all of their injuries seemed rather personal. The medical examiner also noted that all of the injuries appeared consistent, likely caused by a single weapon or one very similar in size and shape. Some marks were long and parallel, pointing to something like a nightstick or shotgun barrel, which we've been talking about this entire time, which matches what investigators suspected, that the murder weapon may have been the barrel of a broken shotgun. Though the barrel itself was never recovered, the rest of the shotgun, the buttstock, was found inside the home, bloodied and abandoned. Now keep in mind, this crime scene was described as extremely violent, soaked in blood, a literal bloodbath. Forensic expert Michael Knox testified that there was simply no way the killer could have left that scene without being absolutely covered from head to toe in blood. Now, according to him, cleaning off that much blood wouldn't have been quick or easy. It would have taken significant time and effort, likely involving scrubbing the skin with a brush to get into all the creases and pores. Michael Knox emphasized that blood would have been even in the smallest parts of the body: ears, fingernails, skin folds. So how did Guy Jr. supposedly manage to, allegedly overpower and kill multiple mobile adults, teens, and a child in such a brutal way without a single fresh injury on him and without a single trace of blood? That question still lingers today. It wasn't just the violence that stunned the jury, it was the scale. Nearly every victim was targeted viciously and repeatedly. The only survivor, 3-year-old BJ, suffered severe brain damage and was never able to testify. In 2011, defense lawyers were allowed to observe DNA testing on items from the crime scene, including the broken shotgun stock. And that same year, the original judge stepped down for unrelated reasons. Guy Jr. pleaded not guilty in February 2012. Again, this entire time, the prosecution's theory was simple but chilling. According to them, they say that Guy Jr. killed his family for drugs and money. Specifically, They believe he was after the painkillers that were prescribed to Michael. And then when Guy Jr. couldn't get the pills peacefully, that's when prosecutors say he came back and killed everyone, then took the drugs and whatever money he could find. The lead investigator in this case testified that Guy Jr. had wanted to get the drugs earlier in the night, but failed, and then allegedly returned later, killed all the victims, and then took Michael's medication and all the money that was in the home, though only around $61 was ever found. Now, I want you to remember that police discovered pills that match Michael's prescription in the car that Guy Jr. had been driving the night of the murders and the day before, a Mercury Cougar that was owned by another victim, Russell Jr. Now, this was the vehicle that Guy Jr. claims that Russell Toler Jr. called him earlier in the night and asked him to help fix. So he claimed after that he had permission to borrow it after he helped his cousin fix it just hours earlier. But a witness claimed that Russell Jr. never let anyone drive his car. But according to all accounts, Guy Jr. wasn't just anyone, he was family. That same witness also testified that Guy asked him where to buy cocaine that night. One of the prosecution's earliest witnesses was Ronald Parker. Ronald Parker testified that he had worked with victims Russell Sr. and Russell Jr. at the Arrow Instant plant. And according to Russell, he had also worked with Guy Jr. just for a short period of time at the plant as well. And while the two were working together, Ronald claims that Guy Jr. had once complained to him that his father, Guy Sr., was going to give money to Joseph West, Chrissy's boyfriend, for a shrimp boat and money to someone else. Ronald testified on the stand that Guy told him, "He ain't never gonna give me and my brother anything. I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill them all." Now, Ronald Parker claimed that this was said 3 to 5 weeks before the murders took place. But under cross-examination, Guy's defense attorney pointed out that Guy hadn't worked with Parker for over a year, undermining Ronald's timeline and credibility. And when confronted, Ronald stumbled and the defense accused him of lying for attention, accordingly saying, "You're coming into this courtroom and making this up to get your 15 minutes of fame and be on that camera right there." Now, Guy's defense attorney, Nichole Hamilton Jr., questioned how his client could have carried out the murders alone, especially when some of the victims, there was evidence that they fought back, and others were found in different rooms scattered across the mobile home. He emphasized that no murder weapon was ever found, although investigators believed it was the barrel of a shotgun. The broken stock was found at the scene, but not the barrel. This also challenged the prosecution's argument that Guy Jr. was under some sort of drug-crazed spell when the crime occurred. Now, while prosecutors painted a picture of drug-fueled rage, there was no conclusive evidence that Guy was under the influence of cocaine or any specific substance at the specific time of the murders, even though he did have substances in his system. The defense also challenged the crime scene investigation. Guy's defense team pointed out lapses in evidence handling, such as officers not wearing protective suits or failing to collect bloody clothing. Now, one of the lieutenants admitted that these were valid criticisms, but insisted that he trusted the work of his fellow officers.
From the beginning, the defense criticized how Glenn County Police investigated the case, failing to follow up on leads, cross-contaminating evidence, or not collecting it at all. Chief Doring says Hines was the sole killer in this case, but he admits his department could have done a better job handling the investigation.
What will you do differently?
Those things have already been done. They've already been corrected.
Like what?
We'll leave it alone for right now. I think it's self-evident what those changes would be.
One of the investigators defended their procedures, claiming that the lack of Tovec suits didn't necessarily compromise the evidence or the crime scene. He also explained that the small, messy trailer made it nearly impossible to establish clean areas for evidence collection. The defense brought in forensic experts to argue their case. Dr. Jonathan Arden, a forensic pathologist, said it was highly unlikely that a single person could have controlled and killed 8 people in such a small space without help. He pointed out that none of the victims were tied up or heavily sedated, which would typically be necessary for one attacker to overpower so many people. Now, crime scene consultant Michael Knox agreed to this, pointing to blood spatter evidence that suggested multiple attackers. He said some victims were killed simultaneously from different directions, which would have been nearly impossible for one person to manage alone. This crime scene consultant in particular estimated that there were at least 3 and possibly up to 5 attackers. At one point, he even said this: "There's no physical evidence to tie him to this crime." Despite the graphic nature of the crime scene, the investigation raised serious concerns from the start. The defense pointed out that police failed to follow basic forensic procedures, none of the victims were processed for fingerprints, and several blood-stained items of clothing photographed at the scene were never collected or tested. One critical piece of evidence introduced at trial was a pair of shorts allegedly worn by Guy Jr., which, according to the prosecution, contained the blood of 3 different victims. Prosecutors claimed this tied him to the murders, but the defense argued that the sloppy evidence handling made such claims unreliable. Guy's reasoning for the blood on his clothes is because when he came home to find his family slaughtered, his immediate thought was to check for survivors, like many of us probably would, which you can hear in the 911 call as he shouts out, "Michael is still breathing." So, according to him, he was going around seeing if anyone was still alive while his neighbor Peggy was on the phone with 911, thus why his loved one's blood was on his shorts. Still though, prosecutors pushed back, saying that the jury didn't need to decide whether Guy Jr. acted alone, only whether he committed the crimes. Prosecutor John B. Johnson dismissed the defense experts' theories as simple guesses. And while the murder weapon was never recovered, the evidence against him included blood on his shorts, the pills in the car, and his suspicious behavior that night. Suspicious. And while prosecutors claimed he acted in a drug-fueled rage, they also suggested he had the clarity to meticulously clean up and get rid of the weapon, a contradiction that raises serious questions. According to prosecutors, Guy Jr. attacked and killed the 8 members of his family sometime between 2:30 and 4:30 a.m. the morning of the 29th. They claimed he then cleaned himself up, hid the murder weapon, and drove to St. Simon's Island, where he appeared calm, cool, collected, and clean on surveillance footage at a Best Western motel by around 5:30 a.m. But when you examine the timeline more closely, that theory begins to break down. At 11:40 p.m., the night before the family was found brutally killed, Joseph, Michelle, Chrissy, and her son BJ were all captured on CCTV at a store on US 17, alive and appearing and acting normally. Then at 2:16 a.m., the morning Guy Jr. found everyone dead, Michelle had made a phone call to a friend and left a voicemail, showing no indication or signs of distress. A short call was also made from her phone, again around 3:45 a.m., followed by a missed dial or potential partial dial just minutes later at 3:48. These timestamps interactions place at least one of the victims alive well into the time frame prosecutors allege that the murders occurred. Meanwhile, Guy Jr. is seen around 5:36 a.m. on surveillance footage at the Best Western on St. Simon's Island, where he went to visit his brother, Tyler, who was staying there. He and Tyler then had breakfast at the Huddle House, which was nearby, at around 6 a.m. that morning, with a receipt timestamped at 7:10 a.m. The two returned to the motel, and that's when Guy left for the trailer park shortly after. Then, as we all know, he arrived back at the New Hope Mobile Park around 8 a.m. as confirmed by his neighbor Peggy, who, again, not only saw him arrive at the mobile home park, but also heard his screams and saw his visible signs of distress. This sequence of events, phone records, CCTV footage, eyewitness accounts, and timestamp receipts shrinks the window of opportunity for the murders to nearly nothing. It raises a compelling question. How could Guy have carried out a brutal, prolonged attack, avoided all visible injury and blood, disposed of the murder weapon, cleaned himself up so thoroughly, and still maintained a composed demeanor on camera and in public, all well before 5:30 a.m. It's hard to ignore how rare, almost unheard of, this kind of crime would be. 8 people beaten to death one by one over several hours, without restraints, without anyone escaping, and without a single gunshot, and without neighbors hearing anything. There is even proof that some of the victims have fought back, and yet the person accused of doing all this had no real injuries on him. No defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle. That alone gives people a serious pause. The defense argued that police zeroed in on Guy too quickly and ignored other suspects, including someone who had allegedly made threats against the family in the past. They claimed sloppy police work and tunnel vision led to the wrong person being charged. From the beginning, the investigation was riddled with mistakes that raised more questions than answers. Bloody handprints found at the scene didn't match Guy Jr. or anyone in the home, yet investigators ordered labs to only compare them to Guy's, but when the prints didn't match, they were ignored. Key evidence was mishandled or just outright destroyed. Guy's shorts had blood on them, which the prosecution used heavily, but 2 neighbors testified he had no blood on his clothes when he first arrived to the home that morning, backing up his claim that he got the blood on him while trying to help his dying family. Police failed to test Guy for injuries or blood under his nails, which is typically standard practice in a violent crime like this. Shockingly, one crucial piece of evidence said to show Guy's palm print was destroyed during state testing, despite a court order to preserve it. And perhaps one of the most overlooked but potentially game-changing pieces of evidence wasn't even taken seriously by investigators. Not long after the murders, the manager of the New Hope Plantation trailer park said she found something strange. A bloody pair of nunchucks tucked inside an old tire just outside the victim's home. She did what most people would do. She called the police. That call was even recorded, but for some reason, those nunchucks were never logged as evidence. The police didn't even tell the prosecution. The defense didn't know either. In fact, no one heard a word about them until weeks later when the trailer park manager casually asked in the courthouse, "Hey, whatever happened to the bloody nunchucks?" Had this weapon been collected and tested, it could have literally changed the entire trajectory of this case. If DNA or blood evidence on the nunchucks didn't match Guy Jr., it might have introduced a viable alternate suspect and possibly even cleared his name altogether. Instead, it became just another unanswered question in a case already full of them. These weren't small oversights. They were major missteps that denied the defense a fair chance and should have given any juror serious pause. At the very least, they opened the door wide for reasonable doubt. But despite all this room for doubt, on October 25, 2013, Guy Jr. was found guilty on all counts of murdering 8 members of his family and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury ultimately found him guilty on all counts, 8 murders, aggravated assault, and 2 drug charges, one for the painkillers and the other for marijuana, and the trial had lasted about 10 days, but getting to this point took 4 years of delays, evidence issues, and legal wrangling. This verdict came after the jury deliberated for just about 4 hours. Prosecutors had originally been seeking the death penalty, but agreed to drop it as part of a deal with the defense when one juror had to be replaced mid-deliberations. Jurors were unaware that prosecutors had ruled out a possible death sentence until after they returned with a guilty verdict. That particular juror, referred to as Juror 152, had told others early in the trial that he couldn't convict Guy Jr. and was overheard discussing the case with his wife, which is against court rules. So because of his removal, the judge declared the jury had to start deliberations over again with a new alternate juror. With this change, the prosecution and victims' families agreed it was better to remove the death penalty as an option to avoid a mistrial and get closure. When the final verdict was read, Guy Jr. appeared emotionless, but his younger brother, Toler, was visibly upset, yelling angrily as he left the courtroom, still believing that his older brother was innocent. The Toler family, relatives of the victims, later said they didn't want the death penalty anyway. They preferred that Guy Jr. had to spend the rest of his life in the general prison population. That's the easy way out, Diane Eisenhower said, whose ex-husband was Russell Sr. and 4 children were among those slain. She said she's satisfied knowing that Hines should spend the rest of his life in prison. It's a relief. Now I just pick up the pieces and go on. Guy grew up in this family, Hazel Sumner said, who described herself as a cousin to the Toler family. It was just greed and drugs that did this. Throughout the trial, Guy's grandmother, Jean, and his brother Tyler were by his side. They've always stood firmly behind him, convinced of his innocence, not just because they love him, but because they know him better than anyone. And to this day, Guy's loved ones believe in his innocence. The verdict shocked many, not just his loved ones, but also those who had followed the case closely and questioned how the jury had reached such a conclusion given the lack of physical evidence and the inconsistencies in the prosecution's timeline. Interestingly, several jurors who sat through the trial later spoke out, and what they shared raised even more questions. 5 of the 12 jurors were interviewed after the trial. Their words painted a picture of uncertainty and confusion. Some of the language they used to describe Guy was far from what you'd expect if they believed he was a violent killer. Words like compassionate, heartfelt, genuine, and that the case leaned strong in his favor. And when it came time to deliberate, the jury couldn't initially agree. 3 jurors didn't believe Guy was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. The judge instructed them to try again. Eventually, 2 of those 3 changed their minds, but 1 remained firm. That's when that individual juror was ultimately dismissed after a private meeting and a new juror was brought in. With deliberations starting fresh, the jury eventually returned a unanimous guilty verdict. But here's the kicker. 2 young jurors later admitted that they were confused during most of the trial. If even jurors had trouble understanding the trial, how could they confidently convict someone beyond a reasonable doubt? Under Georgia law, Guy Jr. faced an automatic life sentence once the death penalty was off the table. The only thing Superior Court Judge Stephen Scarlett had to decide was whether the defendant would ever be eligible for parole. Guy Jr.'s defense team presented no witnesses and didn't really try to persuade the judge before their client's sentence was imposed. Newell Hamilton Jr., Guy Jr.'s lead defense attorney, declined to comment after the hearing. There are people who believe in Guy and believe in he's innocent, said Heather Teston, who said she had been a friend of Guy Jr. since high school. Maybe they should have moved the trial somewhere else. After 4 years, everybody here has been set in their opinions on the case. I think ultimately he was railroaded by the justice system. Guy Jr. has been behind bars since August 2009. After being convicted in October 2013 and sentenced to life without parole for the brutal killings of his father and 7 others, his legal team quickly launched an appeal. They claimed his trial was riddled with problems, from ineffective counsel to excluded evidence they believed was crucial to his defense. But in 2017, the Georgia Supreme Court upheld his conviction, a crushing blow to his supporters, though far from the end of the fight. Soon after sentencing, Guy's attorneys filed a motion for a new trial, arguing that his right to a fair trial was compromised when the juror was removed during deliberations. That juror had admitted during selection that his daughter once knew Guy Jr. and was later dismissed following a heated dispute with the jury foreman. In a deal made behind closed doors, Guy Jr. agreed not to object to the juror's removal, and in exchange, the prosecution dropped the death penalty. When the trial court denied the motion, Guy appealed again, this time claiming he hadn't fully understood the terms of that agreement. But the Georgia Supreme Court disagreed, saying there was no evidence he was misled. His final appeal was rejected in December 2020, effectively shutting the door on any new trial, at least for now. Yet, despite the court's decisions, many still believe Guy Jr. is innocent, or, at the very least, that the case against him left room for reasonable doubt. From the beginning, critics have said investigators zeroed in on Guy Jr. way too quickly, ignoring other possibilities or other suspects. They argue bias shaped the narrative from the start, in that law enforcement, overwhelmed by the scale of the crime, ultimately rush to judgment. Guy's case is riddled with problems, from missing evidence, unanswered questions, and unreliable witnesses to serious investigative missteps. With so many inconsistencies, it's hard to understand how anyone could say, with confidence, that he was guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And yet, the jury did. Over the years, this case has sparked national conversation. Social media campaigns, rallies, online forums, and documentaries have called attention to alleged flaws in the investigation and trial. There's even a Facebook page dedicated to Guy's innocence, dedicated to helping him get justice. His supporters claim he's a man wrongfully convicted and that the justice system failed him. Guy's girlfriend, Jody, continues to advocate for his innocence and raise awareness about his case through her podcast, Guy's Voice, which is dedicated to highlighting what she and many others believe is a grave miscarriage of justice. Now serving a life sentence without parole at Hays State Prison, Guy Jr. remains vocal about his innocence. From behind bars, he has participated in live streams and interviews, still insisting he doesn't know who committed the murders, but he says he might have an idea. He suggested the killings could have been drug-related, noting that Joseph West, Chrissy's boyfriend, was allegedly involved in the drug scene when he lived with the family. Guy has even speculated, without evidence, that a drug cartel could have been involved, but maintains that he had no part or idea what happened.
Do you know or have any idea who may have done this? That's like one of the most popular questions.
I don't know who did it. I have an idea who did it. The cartel. And this is so hard for everybody to believe. Because listen, nobody in that house did anything to deserve that, period. There was only one person in the house, and I'm not speaking ill of them. Joe. Joe sold drugs, and I'm not saying Joe did anything he didn't deserve what happened in, period. But he had a shrimp boat. And where I come from, the cartel, that's how drugs come in, on shrimp boats, okay? And that's the only thing that I can put together what happened. Joe was supposed to bring something in on the shrimp boat. He messed up the money, messed up something, or didn't want to do it again. That's how it happens too. And this is so hard for people that don't know nothing about this life, or never been in this life, or never on the coast to understand. You can't wrap your mind around it. But the cartel is controlled there. I know for a fact. I don't know for a fact that the cartel did, that's who had this done. And where we're from, shrimp boats, everything comes in on shrimp boats.
One of his most steadfast supporters was his brother, Toler, who publicly defended Guy's innocence for years, and he tragically passed away in 2022. Guy Jr.'s case recently caught the attention of someone who knows all too well what it's like to be wrongfully convicted. Greg Kelly, whose own fight for justice became a national story. Greg Kelly was wrongfully convicted in 2014 and sentenced to 25 years for a crime he didn't commit, allegedly sexually assaulting a young boy. After serving 3 years, new evidence emerged, and in 2017, Judge Donna King declared Greg was innocent. His case, highlighted in the documentary Outcry, galvanized a powerful support network that exposed major flaws in the justice system. Motivated by his own fight for exoneration, Greg and his team launched the Vindication Foundation, a nonprofit focused on helping others who have been falsely accused. Now, that same foundation has taken on Guy Jr.'s case, bringing renewed hope, national attention, and advocacy to his ongoing legal battle. Just as Greg Kelly once rallied on the strength of his supporters and relied on them to expose a miscarriage of justice, Guy Jr. now finds himself backed by the same relentless advocacy, with the Vindication Foundation stepping in to help uncover the truth behind one of Georgia's most controversial murder convictions.
Vindication Foundation. It's the ability to use the cards that were dealt to you in life to go and help somebody else who's going through exactly what you once went through. And so that's kind of where we're operating from now with the Vindication Foundation. And I am honored to say that we have accepted and are going to represent and help free and bring home an innocent soul whose name is Guy Hines Jr. He's going to be the first guy that we go and fight for. He's the first guy that we're going to rally for. And we need your help, please, if you can, to use the networks you have, also your voice, to just follow along and learn more.
Why was Guy not at the house? Let's talk about that first. Guy was not at the house because he drove his car down to a park and did drugs. Then he drove back home, and when he got back home, his whole family had been murdered. He walks in early in the morning, finds his Down syndrome cousin beaten almost to death. He runs outside, yells at the neighbors to call the police, which is exactly what you do if you just beat 8 people to death.
Yeah.
He gets in bed with his cousin and keeps him alive until the ambulance gets there, and had 1 drop of blood on his shorts. He was wearing shorts and then basketball shorts underneath the shorts that he was wearing, kind of thing. And that blood from his cousin that was the only drop of blood that he had on him, was from being in bed with his cousin, keeping the last remaining witness, supposedly, keeping him alive until the ambulance got there. Not only are they alleging that he killed all other 7, but that he beat his Down syndrome cousin almost to death and then kept him alive until the ambulance. It's just such a stupid story.
Yeah,
right?
It doesn't make any sense.
Several witnesses that claim that they found bloody nunchucks in their yard and bloody hammer in their yard. They called the police. The police came and got them with blood and hair on them that were obviously used for these 8 murders, and they got lost.
So guys, I know right now you're probably emotionally touched and you want to know how you can help, right? This is the same thing when Greg and I first started to do our research on Guy Hines and Jake Bryden, who you saw just last episode, who's shared his experience with fighting for Guy this far, right? We're doing that, okay? And in the description below, you can go to the vindicationfoundation.com and you're going to have an opportunity to donate to start to fight for Guy's case, right? You're going to be able to see and follow the content, guys. Follow the vindicationfoundation.com, but follow on all platforms, the Vindication Foundation, and follow Guy's story, right?
And his legal team continues to explore new options to this day, including modern DNA testing and forensic techniques that weren't available in 2009. They believe such advancements could uncover previously undetectable evidence that could potentially clear his name. And so while the courtroom verdict may have marked the end of a legal chapter, for many in Glynn County and beyond, the case is far from over. It still haunts the community, a wound that never truly healed. The only surviving member of that night, Chrissy's son, BJ, just 3 years old at the time, is now a teenager, young adult, living with his paternal grandmother. His life, like so many others touched by this tragedy, remains forever altered. If the motive truly was drugs, as prosecutors argued, then the heartbreak cuts even deeper. A father, a family, a future, all lost to addiction, violence, and a moment that changed everything. And if Guy Jr. isn't the one responsible, if the true killer is still out there, then not only has an innocent man lost his freedom, but the victims and their loved ones have been denied the justice that they deserve. In fact, growing public concern and speculation have led to a Change.org petition calling for the Georgia Supreme Court to re-examine the case with the highest level of scrutiny. Currently, the petition has over 1,300 signatures. Supporters of this petition argue that the evidence, unanswered questions, and potential for reasonable doubt demand another look. Not just for Guy, but for the memory of those who were lost. What happened at New Hope Trailer Park was a brutal, horrific tragedy, and no one denies that. But from the very beginning, mistakes were made in the investigation and the trial. Evidence was lost, mishandled, or destroyed. Ironically, always in ways that seemed to favor the prosecution. Every critical error fell on the shoulders of law enforcement and the DA's office, yet many believe it was Guy Jr. who paid the price for those failures. 14 years later, that question still hangs in the air. Did we get the right person? Was justice actually served? The Glynn County Massacre remains among the most horrifying crimes in the state's history. 8 people bludgeoned to death in a scene so brutal that even seasoned investigators were shaken. And while a jury ultimately convicted Guy Jr. and sentenced him to life without parole, the story didn't end there. This case has left a lasting scar on Glynn County. For years, the community grappled with the weight of a crime that felt too big, too senseless, too tragic to fully comprehend. The loss of an entire family shattered more than just a household. It shattered trust, stability, and for some, faith in the justice system itself. Despite the conviction, many still question whether the right person is behind bars. Many people believe that there's simply too much reasonable doubt in this case. Too many unanswered questions, alternative theories, and investigative missteps. For them, the conviction feels less like justice and more like a rush to close a horrific chapter. For many, Guy was judged not by facts, but by perception, written off because of his drug use or where he lived or his upbringing, even his wealth, or lack thereof. And to this day, many are standing up by Guy Jr. and standing up for what they believe is a deep injustice. But for others, the facts are clear. Guy Jr.'s actions were monstrous and justice was done. In their eyes, the cold-blooded killer behind the massacre is behind bars. But the legacy of this case lives on, not only in Georgia, court records, but in the silence left behind in that home, in the life of a child who survived, and in the voices of those who still demand answers. So I leave you with the questions that continue to echo in Glynn County, the state of Georgia, and beyond. Do you believe Guy Hines Jr. is guilty? Or do you think the justice system got it wrong? Was justice truly served? Is the correct killer behind bars? And most of all, did this family, in the end, receive justice? I can't say. There are arguments to both sides. But if he's truly innocent, then he doesn't just deserve hope. He deserves his freedom. I'd love to hear your thoughts, share your opinions, your doubts, your reflections about this case in the comments below. It is deeply polarizing and many are divided on whether or not Guy Jr. is actually guilty. But one thing is certain, while the final judgment has been made in Guy Hines Jr.'s case, his story and the legacy of the Glynn County Massacre are far from over.